So let's get started. And today is our episode 3, and we're going to be looking at balanced literacy in English language learners. And let's just talk about our journey. We've had such a great journey together. Our first episode talked about the 4 C's framework and how we engage in creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and how we build those 21st learning century skills. And then we moved last week into gradual release of responsibility, which really just capitalizes on the 4 C's framework. And we talked about how we release that cognitive demands to students to make them independent learners. And then today, it fits right in. Today we will set sail. So remember my journey. We did our car trip, and then last week we set flight into gradual release, and then this week we will set sail as we talk about balanced literacy in English language learners. And then next week we'll move all into practical application, how this all folds in. I will be joined by several teachers in the region, and we'll just share best practices that we can use in the classroom and in our blended model classrooms. So I'm so excited for this journey. So let's set sail with me today. This is our theme. We have a nautical theme, and we'll be traveling and moving throughout the sea today as we look at balanced literacy. Just a few of those housekeeping. If you can please communicate throughout the chat. That's how we'll communicate today. The hand signals do not work through the webinar, but we will make sure that I'll answer and stop to answer questions and make this as interactive as possible. Okay, perfect. So if you know a little bit about me and you've joined me for previous sessions, I am Davita Austin. I'm an educational consultant with National Geographic Learning, but I've also been an educator for over 25 years. So education is at the heart of everything that I do. And one of the things that I love about National Geographic Learning, all of their resources are grounded in the pedagogy and the research that I'll be sharing with you throughout this series. And I truly believe in best practices for students, but I'm also what I consider myself a transformational leader, which is building capacity with teachers and giving them the toolbox so that they can go into the classroom and provide best practices. So I've been a teacher, an educational leader in the United States, and I've also led schools here in the GCC region. So again, thank you for joining me. And as you know me, if you've been joining me over the last sessions, I always like to do some type of activating activity. And today I just want to talk about social well-being. And social well-being for teachers and staff working in schools is just a growing importance today, especially as teachers are tackling working in blended or hybrid classrooms online, and especially as we move through this crisis globally with the pandemic. So one activity that I always used to like to do with my staff at the beginning of the year, I call it the Compass Rose activity. It's a great team building activity, and I feel like sometimes during these times we need to do a well-being check and do some team building together. And when I used to do this with my teachers, the purpose is so that we could know a little bit about each other, know about our leadership styles, how we work in groups, how we work together. And this is an activity that you can take back. You can even do it now within your teams if you're a grade level lead, or if you're a coordinator, or just with a group of teachers, just to kind of check and see how do you guys work best together to bring out the most positive outcomes for students. So this is the Compass Rose activity. I put in the chat at the very beginning a link. If you didn't get a chance, please download the link. And I want you to look at the different leadership styles, and I also call them learning styles, that we all bring to the organizations that we work in, okay? And I want you to read through all of them and think, which style best fits me? Am I a North leader, or in a team? Am I East? Am I South? Am I West? Or am I somewhere in between? So we're just gonna take a 2-minute stop. I want you to read through the materials. If you aren't able to download it, just let me know, but just read through it and think about which best fits you. And you may be somewhere in between, okay? Because I certainly am. When I do this activity, I switch a little bit, okay? As I grow, as I learn more. about myself and leadership and about education and how I work with children and those around me, or how I work with colleagues as well. So take about 2 to 3 minutes. I want everyone to read the material, and then I want you to share out in the chat what on that in the information best describes your leadership style or your learning style as a group leader. Okay, so I'm going to put my timer on, and then as I'm doing that, I'll answer some questions in the chat as well. So the materials are downloaded. At the beginning, if you scroll back up, there is a Dropbox link, and if you just click on that, you're able to download it to your desktop. And I'll resend it. Some people are asking me to resend it. I definitely will. And there you go. So it's down at the bottom now. Welcome. There you go. So take about 2 minutes. Think about your style as a leader, and then we'll come back as a group. Some people are saying Northwest, very interesting. Generally West. Thank you, Anne. And I'm going to share mine in a minute, so this is very interesting. So thank you, everyone. West, sometimes Northwest, okay? Visionary, okay. So I think, Dima, if you can download the materials, then you'll be able to understand what everyone is saying in the chat. We're looking at your learning style, your leadership style. How do you present yourself when you're working in a group? Great. Okay, and if I had to, thank you guys for just participating in this, and I think it's just a great team building activity to do with your teams as you kind of just do a wellness check. I consider myself a Southwest, okay? I'm a Southwest. When I first started working, I felt like I was more Northwest, okay? But I'm more of a Southwest. I'm really about building communities with the people that I work with, building relationships, but I'm also very task-oriented in everything that I do. So everything I do, I have my schedule is put in place. I'm very oriented in every single detail. And I teach that way too. So I'm a collaborator as a teacher. So I'm about team building in my classroom, building groups, but I'm also very task-oriented and very systematic. So as we're talking today about balanced literacy, kind of keep that in your mind, because sometimes the way you are as a leader or the way you work in groups often falls into your teaching style as well. So be thinking about that as we talk about literacy and all of the things that are very important for English language learners. Be thinking about how you are, your own skills and your strengths that you bring to the table. And this is great when you work with groups and looking at the many skills of the group. So thank you, Huda Southeast. And I see that joining me today, there are many different people that fall under that spectrum. So again, this is called the Compass Rose. I have even had teachers to do this with their middle and high school students as well. So this is an activator that you can do with students as well. Okay, so thank you for participating. And let's just look at our compass, because remember, we're setting sail into balanced literacy. Let's look at our compass and our goals for today. So today, participants will demonstrate an understanding of those best practices of a holistic and a balanced language arts program. This is probably my favorite topic to talk about. Okay, I get very excited when I talk about literacy, and I get very excited when I talk about helping children to read, not just children that are English language learners, but all students that may struggle with reading. So I get very excited. And so we're going to develop an understanding of the balanced literacy framework and the impact. I'm really going to focus on the impact for English language learners. We will also discuss and analyze strategies which increase English language skills. So always taking it back to English language learners, increasing their English skills and their literacy skills, and why the balanced literacy framework is so important for those two elements. So let's just think, as we're kind of thinking about reading, because reading is kind of the essence of everything that we do, that everything that we ask students to do, it involves reading of some sort. So let's just talk about, and you can put some ideas in the chat. What do you believe? What makes a good reader? And you can annotate on the screen if you would like, or you can put it in the chat. But what do you believe makes a good reader at any age group? But what makes a good reader? Someone who pays attention to details. Love it. Yeah, definitely. And I'll resend the materials, Layla, I'll resend them shortly. A good reader, someone also put someone who has knowledge of the content. Very good. Someone that's curious. I love that one, because that really talks about balanced literacy. A visualizer. Someone's a focused reader. That's passion. And I said, that's my passion. Reading is my passion, especially when I was a teacher. It was my passion. They provide illustration. These are good. Able to comprehend. Accessible and manageable to content. Very important, Edwina. Thank you for that. And they love to read. These are great. And then I'm going to add some that I've added here too. So I've also added, a good reader is able to infer or draw inferences when they're reading. And I'll discuss shortly why that's so important. I also put here that a good reader monitors their understanding as they read. They evaluate text, so they can evaluate, they have those skills. And if you join me for the first session, we talked about why that's so important to be able to evaluate and use those critical thinking skills. They make predictions, so before they even read, they're able to activate their prior knowledge and make predictions. They interact with the text, okay? So they can interact with the text, they can bring something to the text and then glean meaning and understanding from the text. They comprehend a variety of texts, not just fiction, but a variety of texts, and read different genres. Make meaning. I believe this is important. They make meaning of text structure, so they understand text structure. And a lot of you said this one as well, they read independently. So a good reader loves, and as someone said, has a passion for reading. So good readers have a passion for reading. They read independently. They choose. But students just don't become good readers. We have to kind of prime them with all of these strategies, all these skills, so they can get to this last one, that they're reading independently. So why are we talking about this? Kind of the why. I always like to say, what is the why for anything we do? And the reason is because we always need to think about, and there's so much research about this, but how do educators support English language learners while they learn to read, write, and acquire English? And look at the three things that I underlined: while they learn to read, write, and acquire English. That's so important. So there's some research out there from Fontes and Pinnell, and I use them a lot through this presentation because they're kind of grounded in this along with Clay and guided reading. They're researchers that really look at best practices for students that struggle with reading or struggle with English. And they kind of look at this through three domains. What are the cognitive demands that we put on English language learners, what cognitive demands do they have? Also looking at their well-being, okay, which is important while we're online, looking at their well-being, and then that linguistic piece. Okay, so those are those three pieces that they put it into. And here I kind of looked at what does that mean. So when we talk about cognitive demands, I'm talking about that instruction, that access to grade level standards. And if you see what I put for teaching and learning, setting high expectations, I often find a misconception that educators sometimes say, well, when I'm working with English language learners, or I'm working with students of determination, I should set the bar lower. I should stay at that remediation. But look here, this is those cognitive demands. We want to make sure that we're allowing them to access grade level standards. Of course, through supports, through scaffolded interventions, but we have to expose them to grade level standards and set those high expectations. And we do those things through visual supports or gestures, opportunities for them to interact with you and with their peers in the classroom, opportunities to have language objectives all throughout the curriculum, and we'll talk about that. So not isolated events of language, and using supports in the classroom like language frames, all helping them to access the grade level curriculum. And then when we look at the well-being and why I love talking about balanced literacy, because it's important that, and someone said this when they talked about what makes a good reader, someone said to make them to have passion about reading, to be intuitive about what they read. So they have to be self-assured. And we have to build that within them. So making that language arts time a safe environment for students to learn, following that gradual release of responsibility. And we talked about that last week, and I'll talk about it a little bit more today. Building a community of readers, of writers, to help them acquire English, okay? Fostering the love of literacy and embracing all literacy in your classroom. So an abundance of different styles of genre and literacy in your classroom. And the linguistic piece, of course, is important. Making sure that the strategies we're using in our classroom, the supports that we're using in our classroom, all go here. English proficiency, supporting them with this. So lessons should include listening, speaking, reading, writing, and working with words. And in essence, that's all balanced literacy. So when I talk about that, and you guys know me, if you've been with me over the last 2 weeks, I always go back to my analogy. So setting the sail with balanced literacy. So when I kind of look at a sailboat, there are these components. And so vocabulary is at the anchor of everything that we should do in a classroom. It all goes back to making sure that our English language learners, that they have access to vocabulary, that we're teaching explicit instruction in vocabulary. And then I love to use this. So what's guiding us? Okay, what's guiding us? This current here. And the guide is the guided reading and the guided writing that I'll talk about shortly. And those strategies are embedded here. All here, they're embedded right in the sailboat. All of the strategies that you use as a teacher. And we're setting sail in the winds. What guides us forward, what pushes students forward is balanced literacy framework, or the strategies we'll talk about today, okay? And of course, the teacher, you're guiding as the captain of the sailboat. So this kind of gives you an over idea of balanced literacy. So when I talk about teaching English and reading, what makes this model classroom, you know, for academic English, it should encompass various teaching practices and learning opportunities. Teachers should encourage students to read independently, books and texts. They should encourage pre-writing and pre-reading strategies so that students are primed for the activities that you want them to do, or those objectives within the classroom. Provide an abundance opportunity for writing. Writing should be interchangeable with reading, that you're allowing students to write or to talk orally about their writing, that's in your everyday teaching practices. And a model classroom for balanced literacy should have targeted interventions that focus vocabulary and language. So we call this balance because you see here for this model classroom, we have vocabulary, language, writing, reading, and then all of the word work is intertwined into all of this. So this is a model classroom for balanced literacy. And then here it is in a great chart that many of you have probably seen before if you have been exposed to balanced literacy. But this is the chart that everything that a classroom, a strong language arts classroom, if you're working with English language learners, or even your high performers, okay? Because this helps us to extend learning as well through these strategies. Your classroom should be gleaming with different strategies that help students to read, to write, listening and speaking, which are a part of the Common Core standards as well. Word study activities, which I'll go through today. Those reading, and I'll talk about these different forms of reading as well. And then assessment, ongoing assessment, assessing where students are through those quick formative checks, through progress monitoring, and then those bigger checks through some summative assessments as well. So this is a glance of how balanced literacy looks, and we'll go deeper in just a few seconds. But I want to just stay here for a second, and I want you to think, as a teacher, how does your classroom currently look? Are you in the balanced literacy frame? Are you teaching all of these things, not in isolation, because balance is about bridging them together? Are you more stronger in some areas than other? Just take a second and think about your class today, and I'll kind of look in the chat to see what are you doing. Okay. I love some of the things that I see in the chat, and I want to make this as interactive as possible. So just talk to me about kind of how does your classroom look today? Are you more heavy reading? Are you more heavy writing? Especially in this online setting, how is your classroom looking? And someone said each skill in an individual class. Okay, so someone said they're doing it more in each skill in an individual class. That's fine. We're going to talk about how we're going to bridge it so that we'll see some of these skills interwoven together. Okay. More reading, less writing, okay? Definitely more into reading in general, okay? Okay, I love some of the answers. More writing, listening, and speaking. Okay, so I see that everyone, they have some of those that they're tagging on a little bit more heavily, and then some that they're not focusing on. We're going to talk about how we maybe can bridge some of them together so that you see that students can do some of these activities within one lesson. So we're going to talk about how that could look in your classroom so that you're targeting all of these throughout a week, okay, or throughout your unit of study. Very good. And someone put more reading daily, okay? Thank you for these. Thank you. Reading more as it helps to generate ideas to write, and it definitely does. Thank you, Nasafa. Okay, so let's talk about why this program looks at balancing out a little bit more, okay? So balancing all of those structures. One, when you look at a balanced literacy, it's giving more opportunities for you to guide students, and then for you to show them excellent models of reading and writing behavior. And I'll talk about that when we get into modeled and shared reading and writing, okay? Also, this is a balanced approach because it wants you to look at that intentional skill instruction, systematic, okay? Why it's needed to make sure that your lessons include language, they include writing and reading, all within a lesson. And then important to have that abundant amounts of rich and varied literature, authentic reading and writing activities. So whether that's you having students to respond, someone said they do more reading so they can have something to respond to, which is correct here. Abundance of those reading and writing activities, and then those ongoing assessments. So in a balanced literacy classroom, the role of the teacher changes slightly than regular practices. If you joined me last week, and I'm going to kind of go over it a little bit today as well, we talked about the gradual release of responsibility. And the reason why I discussed that first is because balanced literacy is an excellent bridge into that framework. So the role changes, the teacher is more of a coach, okay? But the teacher understands literacy development. So as a teacher, even when I taught upper elementary, it's important for me to understand what were basic literacy skills that my students, especially my students of determination or my English language learners, what were some of those basic skills that they need to have So I had to understand that alignment of literacy skills, why it's important to intertwine vocabulary in every single lesson. Why was that important? Why was it important to make sure that my students who were having difficulty with decoding, that I gave them decodable text, because I knew that that was a prerequisite that they needed before I could move them on to higher skills. So it's important to look at alignment as well as a balanced literacy teacher. And then that coach, understanding when to intervene, be the coach, be the facilitator, to scaffold and differentiate, and then when to let students to go on their own and to transfer the skills you've taught them. And then you also have to be able to draw students' attention to different text features so that they can work on strategies, those important strategies for reading and writing, for vocabulary, and for acquiring English. And you're modeling. Okay, sometimes we think, I should only model for the younger learners. But when we talk about balanced literacy, there are opportunities for modeling all the way through, even in middle school, even in high school, that you're modeling, that you're giving them opportunities to see exactly the correct way to write, or to use a reading skill, or to use grammar correctly. You're showing them and demonstrating. Shouldn't stay in the modeling long, but you're giving them those exemplars as well. And again, that takes you to that gradual release of responsibility. So you're starting on the stage, as I like to say it, on the stage, and it's that I do, the modeling for students. But you don't stay there long because you want to move into that redo part. Okay, and Dr. Sherry talked about this last week. This is that where students work collaboratively with you guiding them, or your guided instruction, your scaffolding, your differentiation. All building that's constructs for students so that they can get at this last stage where they can do it alone. And not only where they can do it alone, they can transfer the skills that you're teaching them. So why balanced literacy is so important? Because you're giving them skills across vocabulary, word work, across writing and reading, not just so they can do this in language arts, but so students can take those strategies, take those skills, and be able to demonstrate it in math. So someone was a math teacher and they responded. And if you look at math, the Common Core math, it is heavy in language and vocabulary. So there's a lot of reading that has to go in place there. So giving them the skills so they can get to the independent learning and they can take the cognitive demands by themselves, and then they can transfer it to other domains. This is why balanced literacy was put together. So let's look at all of the areas that we talked about. Everything that you saw on the chart for balanced literacy, and we're going to start at reading, because reading is what holds it all together with those other pieces intertwined. And I call it the braid of literacy, okay? They're all intertwined, and that's why it's balanced, and we should be working on those skills at once. So Fontes and Pinnell, and I said I use their research a lot. A lot of what I do in my classroom, that I used to do in my classroom, was heavily grounded in their research and guided reading, all of those different elements of what makes a strong reader. And so they say that there's 7 highly effective strategies that will make students effective readers. And some of you named a few of these when we talked about what do you believe makes a good reader. But these are 7 strategies that you should always include in your lessons, that you're always spiraling back to make sure that students have honed in. And the reason why these 7 strategies are here, because they're strategies that students can use not only during their language arts block, but they can use this in science, math, social studies, and other disciplines as well. So that first strategy is that activating students' prior knowledge, helping them to make connections about a new unit of study from something they may have learned prior. They can predict. You can use this in so many areas when you're introducing new science concepts. Activating is a great strategy that students should be able to use. And they can infer. So as texts become more complex, students have to be able to infer meaning that may not be directly in the text. So those unknown or unwritten. So giving them those skills to understand how to infer, because they'll need that, especially when you get into heavy social studies material, okay, heavy science material as well. They'll need to know how to infer. And that students are able to monitor and clarify. So they're able to look at their own misconceptions by rereading information. They're able to clarify. They're able to ask questions and dialogue within the group and with the teacher so that they're monitoring their understanding about what they're reading. And this will help them across all disciplines as they move into high school as well. And that they can question, okay? That they can ask questions from the text, and you can set those strategies so that students that are English as second language, that they are able to ask questions. You give them those constructs or language frames to support them, but they can question and dialogue with their peers and with the teacher. And they can search and select. So this goes to research, okay? So if you're asking students to do research in other domains and to do projects, do they have the strategies that they know how to search for materials or search for answers within the text? So have you taught them those core strategies? And then can they summarize? And I tell this story, last year I had the opportunity, I was a vice principal in school, but when we went into lockdown, I helped to teach an English class to sixth graders. And we were working on a writing project. And I got all the projects back. And when I was reading them, students verbatim, they were able to go find the information. So great tools to research, so they could search. But when it came to summarizing, it was interesting that some of my sixth graders and some of the bright students, they gave me back verbatim what they found online. They didn't have the basic skills of summarizing. So teaching them early on how to summarize, how to put things in their own words. It's so important when they go to other subject areas as well, and you're asking them to research or to find information, to use critical thinking skills. And they can visualize and organize and extract information from the text. So those are what we call those prime strategies that you can start working with students as early as KG. Helping them to use these skills on a daily basis will make them effective readers. And here are the three that I love talking about, because if you walked into my classroom 12 or 13 years ago, and these strategies are so great for English language learners, or students that struggle, and for my high performing students. These are those core teaching strategies of guided reading, modeled and shared reading, and independent reading. And teachers can use this in their classroom, whether it's in the classroom, and I'll talk about some strategies that you can use if you're online as well. So let's just take a glance at what these are. So let's just kind of compare and contrast. So in a classroom, if a teacher is doing guided reading, they would first start with the modeled or shared. And so remember when I talked about the gradual release, we're starting where the teacher is on the stage. So this is a whole group. So the difference here that this one is a whole group activity, and the teacher is demonstrating. The teacher is modeling. So they're reading, they're showing how to use those strategies. So let's go back here for a second. They're showing how to use those strategies that we talked about just a minute ago. They're demonstrating these, okay? And students are watching, they're engaging, they're questioning, they're participating by once we get to that shared. So the teacher moves into more the facilitator, and students are working together, and the teacher is sharing and modeling with the whole group. So these are whole group activities that you would introduce when you're first starting to introduce your skill or a new text to a class. Then we would move into what we call guided reading. And I love guided reading because this allows you to work with small groups of students at the same ability level, but not just ability level, also that have some of the same reading behaviors. So what do I mean when I say reading behaviors? It may mean that I observe that I have a group of students that their fluency, their rate of fluency is the same. And because of their slow fluency, is impeding how they're understanding the text. And there's an entire lesson with them to work with them on that particular skill. And so this is where I'm guiding. This is where my scaffolding comes in, my interventions, my differentiation comes with these small groups. And here you're supporting, you're scaffolding, and you're assessing students. This is where you're assessing. And during this time, teachers can do one of two things. They can have students read aloud so that you can hear them, especially with the younger students. You can have students do one read at a time, but you're taking notes. And this is kind of forming your instruction for the next day or for the next lesson. And you have students reading, you're stopping so that you can ask questions. Students can ask questions, and you're working towards a common skill. And all of this, and you see how we go straight back to gradual release. We start with that model, shared, small group guided, so that we can let students on their own to go into independent reading. And we're encouraging students to respond and question. We've already provided them with the skills. Students are practicing, whether they're practicing in class or at home, online, and students are justifying their responses. They're recording their answers to the skill that you've been working on with the whole class, or that skill that you were guiding with them in the guided reading. So these are those at the glance, and I like to go just a little bit deeper. So let's look at guided reading. This is your small group. And people often ask, it's hard, Davita, when we're now online, how do we do small group learning? And I'm going to talk about that because there's some different strategies you can use. You can use some of your breakout sessions or schedule just 10-minute quick groups so you can hear and listen to students read and you can work with them. But here are some of these important strategies that you would employ during a guided reading session. So we have these before, during, and after strategies. So before is when we get back to, remember I talked about those important strategies to become an effective reader. This is where we would be activating prior knowledge. We would have students make predictions about the text that they're about to read. Discuss the purpose of the text, what type of text, what text features are going to help them to analyze the text. For my younger students, I would do picture walks and those gallery walks. Without even reading, just have students turn the page and do a picture walk, and we'll talk about what do we think may happen in the story that we're about to read or the text that we're exposing students to. My core vocabulary focus would come here. The vocabulary within the text, that academic vocabulary or the vocabulary that's going to help them to understand the text. And this is where we would use the level readers, okay? Where we would make sure that while we're working on that grade level standard, or we're trying to expose them to grade level standards, we're giving them materials that students can actually read. So we call these level books, level materials that we can still work on grade level strategies, or if we need to differentiate, we can work on the grade they may need help with it. But we will use books that they can access. And then while students are reading, this is where we're highlighting particular strategies that they will need to help them to understand and construct meaning from the text. We're monitoring and supporting students. We're pausing to discuss information, key ideas, and define both student and teacher roles during the session. So defining those roles so that students know what their role is in a guided reading session. And after reading, we want to give students with activities or something that they can do on their own so that they can practice the skill to reinforce the skill from the lesson, okay? And they can work with pairs or they can work independently. And I love this quote, and I just want to take a minute for us to unpack this quote together. So it's guided reading is a context in which a teacher supports each reader's development of effective strategies for processing novel text at increasingly challenging levels of difficulty. So take a minute and think about that. And then if just in the chat, tell me what stands out in this quote. What phrases may stand out to you when you think about guided reading? It's a context in which a teacher supports each reader's development of effective strategies for processing novel text at increasingly challenging levels of difficulty. What stands out to you when you hear or you read this quote? And I'm just looking back on some earlier comments that someone said they believe that these steps that we were talking about helps with reading word problems. You're exactly right. So Rita says that one of the things that stands out that it supports each reader's development. It's the purpose of guided reading. It is the core purpose of guided reading to support development of reading. It's the support to deal with students with weak English, yes. Someone also pointed out within the quote, effective strategies, because that's what it's about. During this supporting period that you're using strategies so that the students can use them independently. Supporting their thought processes, yeah.
Support, develop, challenge. So I'm seeing some of the same, thank you, Edwina. I'm seeing some of the same responses. These are great because that's why guided reading was put in place, is so that you can support students by giving them increasingly complex text. So one of the things I loved about guided reading, by using those level readers, I could track throughout the year the progress that my students were making. And when I was a leader in the building, we actually kept track of the progress, looking at those Lexile levels. So those of you in American schools, you're familiar with Lexiles as a part of the MAP test. And we tracked our success. And we knew that our students were making progress. We knew the data because of this quote. We were increasingly moving them up in those Lexile bands, working on those core strategies so students can draw construct and meaning from increasingly difficult texts. Yeah, and I love this one, processing what my students struggle with the most, reading factual text. And this is a science teacher. You can use, when I was a classroom teacher, I actually had guided reading groups during my science lessons as well, because it's really the same thing. In science, students have to be able to read, and they need those reading strategies to be able to comprehend the science material, which is often difficult for students that struggle with English. So I did guided reading in my science. And I also implemented something called guided math, those small groups, so that I could really expose students to language, to writing throughout other disciplines. And I love this. Creating surprising and threatening novel experience is vital in guided reading. Yes, definitely. Thank you for that. Loving the interaction today. Let's look at just model and shared reading quickly at a glance as well. So when we look at this, it's building students' background knowledge, and that before reading strategies, the kind of those warm-up activities. And in my classroom, this would usually be just a 10-minute quick warm-up where I'm modeling a skill. I'm modeling through a warm-up or through a video that I'm showing, and I'm introducing that text. I'm reading to students. I'm showing them how to use the strategies. And then during the reading, I'm reading aloud, and then I may move into shared, where I'm having students do read aloud, or we're doing choral reading when I was working with younger students. So afterwards, students would be able to go either into a guided reading or into an independent activity using what I have modeled for them. And then independent is exactly what it is. And you can see here those teacher roles during an independent and those student roles, okay? So making sure, again, your role is to make sure students have access to books that they can read at their level, still working on the grade level standard, or standards that you need, and that students are doing some activities, so giving them a purpose for their reading. So whenever you set students off for independent reading time, make sure there's a purpose for their reading. Okay. And see, here's some tools that I just put here, because I know some of you are thinking, okay, how do I do it now? Because my students are learning online. So some classroom strategies you can do for teaching reading on an online setting, that choral reading and those read alouds. Continue to do that. Even though we're online, we need to hear students read. Our English as language learners, we need to hear them read. Display the text online and use your annotation features to highlight, to underline important features of the text. Your interactive whiteboards to model strategies if you're doing a shared or a modeled reading. And those small group sessions for your small guided reading, and you may have to change the time. You may, when you're in school, do a longer session, but just have some quick time that you're working with small groups for those breakout sessions. And providing students some choice boards. So while they're working with you in a group, you can give them some vocabulary or word work activities or writing activities that they can do on their own while you're working with small groups online. And some digital tools that I put here is the Flipgrid and Pear Deck. If you join me next week, 2 teachers are going to demonstrate how these work and how they help when you're reading in class, for you to embed questions to students right into your PowerPoints in your lessons, so students can interact with you in real time. And then again, your breakout rooms in Zoom and Microsoft Teams. So we've already kind of discussed this, but as you're just in the chat, if you can just put down some ideas that you may have for what model, shared reading, or independent reading, or guided reading means to you. And then what are some things that you see that are in common? So those kind of compare and contrast. And while you're kind of chatting out with each other, I'm going to move into writing. and those instructional practices for writing where we're in a balanced literacy classroom. So you see some commonalities here for writing. I still have my modeled and shared writing, guided writing, and independent writing. The only difference is I've moved from reading and I've put these and replaced it with writing. So someone said, you know, some people said I'm spending a little bit more time on reading. So when I was in a classroom, that's kind of where I was too, when I first started introducing myself to balanced literacy and guided reading. But then what I started to do is that I may have a guided reading on one day using those reading strategies. And then the next day in my language arts, I would have the guided writing groups. So one day I would be having my guided reading, the next day my guided writing. So within the week, within my lesson, I'm having opportunities that I'm working with small group, not just on reading, but I'm also working with them on writing as well. And this looks very similar to the guided reading. Your model time is for you to model, to scribe. And again, people always think, I should only do this KG, maybe to grade 2. It's important when we're working with diverse learners that we're able to scribe and model how we would like the writing activities to look. If you're introducing persuasive writing, how do they write that introduction paragraph? Model it and scribe it for them so that once they get to independent, they know exactly what's expected of them because you gave them an exemplar through that. And some of those same things that shared and model time, this is your whole group. You're working with the whole class. Students are, you're scribing, you're giving them the skills. This is your time. And you're having students to do some activities together where they may do something pair shares. They may be writing collaboratively with each other. Even in an online setting, they may write on the whiteboards to demonstrate they understand how to construct those sentences together. And then that guided writing is where you anchor the lesson. You may work with a particular group on a particular skill that you've noticed in their writing is a weak area for them. It could be spelling and putting sentences together that are grammatically correct, okay? So a way to bring language into writing. Remember, it's balanced literacy. So opportunities where you're looking at grammar, language, writing, all in one lesson. And then again, the goal is to get them at independence, where you're conferencing independently with students, giving them feedback that students know and understand through rubrics, through self-assessments that students use, which are great tools. Self-assessments are great tools, especially for students that are English as second language learners, so that they know how to self-assess themselves in writing as well. And here's some quick strategies. And you may look at these and say, ooh, I'm thinking of some other strategies that I can use in my classroom. Please put them in a chat because this is our professional learning community and we're learning from each other. So interactive writing journals, have students to create these. And these are great tools that you can use on an online setting, these interactive writing journals, where you can respond back in real time through the use of some of those applications I've shared. And you can model your writing by sending them videos, okay? Sending them videos or videos to watch if you're teaching how to write an informational piece, okay? Sending them a video that gives them the ideas of how to have a topic sentence, those supporting details and their concluding paragraphs. So showing them videos to help them are great during an online setting. And then providing some time that you can, even if it's just 5 minutes, that you can meet with students in small groups to review their writing. Have students do writing projects where they can video themselves, not necessarily for our students who are struggling, but oral. Remember, if you looked at that chart for balanced literacy, those oral components there as well. So you can use things like Animoto, where they can video themselves or screencastify. And using Google Docs and PowerPoint so students can present writing pieces to you in an online setting. So I'm going to stop right there just for a second, just so I can catch up on the chat and just see. Someone put OneNote as a great digital tool as well. Thank you, Tyree. Okay, peer teaching. And peer teaching is great, especially if you look at those shared opportunities for writing and reading. So thank you for that. And I love this because I'm going to show it in a minute. Someone with math, struggling with word problems in math, I encourage my students to download bedtime math application. I haven't heard of that one, so thank you for that one. I'm going to share another one in a minute. But as I said, I'm just going to talk about this for a second, because when we talk about reading and writing, if you look at Common Core math, and I remember when Common Core first came out, and the first thing that came to my head. I was a teacher at the time. I said, whoa, this is heavy in language. How do I make sure that my students who are English as second language learners or their students with disabilities, how do I make sure that they can make meaning from Common Core math, okay? And it's exactly what someone just said, finding those ways or those strategies, those cool online, making sure you're exposing them to reading and writing strategies that they can use in math as well. So thank you guys for all of the suggestions. These are great. And so then that brings us into word study. So in a balanced literacy classroom, I often, or what teachers will often do, they'll set up their classroom so that while they're doing those guided reading or those guided writing activities, students will be immersed in other activities. So this is the way you can balance it, okay? You can balance it. While you're doing those small group activities, students could be working independently on word study, instructional activities, maybe vocabulary, maybe it's spelling and grammar, phonics lessons. And these are those independent. So you may model or share how to work through those skills, and then you set them off with some independent activities. And the word study and balanced literacy framework is so important because, again, this offers those hands-on and differentiated approach to teach phonics, spelling, and vocabulary. So note that I said all of them: phonics, spelling, and vocabulary, okay? And it's important because our students need to understand how to compare and contrast word features, okay? Understanding words and how they work together and be able to compare and contrast different word families as well. Students should be able to discover similarities and differences within and between categories of words, okay? And students should be able to work in groups or individually with guided instruction to explore the language and words. And remember, this isn't in isolation. So within the construct of your lesson, embedding those opportunities within your writing and within your reading. You know, some of the programs that we use at National Geographic Learning is why I love our resources. They provide opportunities so that students, I think of our Reach Higher program, so that all of these are embedded within the lesson, so students are always working on language and words in the construct of reading and writing as well. So it's building literacy. It's building literacy so that students can acquire English. When you're working with English language learners, remember that first slide that I showed, that should be at the forefront, building literacy so that students can acquire language. So those word study, you want to make sure you engage students in meaningful reading and writing opportunities. First two that I showed you. Provide multiple opportunities to examine the same set of words and using those hands-on approaches to practice words. And I put vocabulary, if you remember my sailboat, I had vocabulary as the anchor. And the reason why is because look at this quote. I love this quote. Vocabulary is the glue that holds stories, ideas, and content together, making comprehension accessible for children. Read that one again on your own. Because students need vocabulary. They need words. They need to understand how to use words, whether those are academic words, everyday words. And we need to provide explicit instruction. So when we're introducing new texts or new skills, we need to make sure that vocabulary is at the forefront of everything that we do to help them to glean meaning from different styles and genre of text and different styles of writing as well. So that explicit instruction, that repetition of vocabulary should be taught to help students acquire words. And the reason why I love to show this is because vocabulary, look at these tiers of these hierarchies. So I'm going to start here at the bottom because this is what we call tier one, are just basic everyday language words, these high frequency words. And in the English language, there's over 8,000 high frequency words in language families. And these are words that students should acquire naturally. But sometimes our students who are English as second language learners, they don't acquire some of these high frequency words naturally. So when we're our early learner teachers that are joining me today, our KG teachers, we need to make sure that we're exposing students to these high frequency words, that they're naturally within the environment, okay? This is where we spend our time, that explicit teaching I was just talking about, within the tier two. So these are words needed to understand and express complex ideas in an academic context. So these are the words that we're going to glean meaning from when we're reading, when we're writing. in math, okay? The vocabulary that's in math, the vocabulary that's in science, or different texts that we're reading. So this is that explicit teaching in this tier 2, where most of our instruction, daily instruction, whether it's science, math, social studies, okay? In order for students to acquire English and to be successful in our classroom, we have to make sure in this tier 2 that we're giving explicit teaching here. And then that tier 3, that tier 3, this is something students may not come in contact with every day, but especially as they move into secondary, these are words that are in a specific topic or a domain of study, okay? The words that students need to know if they're in a physics class or a chemistry class, that's really to just a domain of study. So this is how we look at vocabulary and how we need to make sure that we're teaching vocabulary within our classroom, in a balanced literacy classroom. And I've put just a few because there's so many strategies you can use when you teach vocabulary. But I always want to just go back to some of these one line, and please share some. But I love Quizlet, because Quizlet you can use, one, most people use it as their performance checks, okay? They're quick checks for understanding, they're quizzes that they may do at the end of a class. But they also have vocabulary flashcards embedded within the program, and I love them. They're flashcards, they're able to give you words within a sentence, they're pictures, and so this is just a great way to teach vocabulary in a classroom in an online setting. And then Bingo Bongo is a new one that a first grade teacher shared with me, and it's a fun games using vocabulary, and you can, as a teacher, can put the vocabulary words in for students. It's another free digital tool. And then for your math teachers who are thinking, how does this relate to me? Because balanced literacy, again, the framework is based so that students can take all of these skills we're discussing today and use them across the disciplines. And so mathwords.com is a great vocabulary tool to use, especially for middle and high school students, okay? So it's a great tool to use when you're teaching vocabulary. And then some of those classroom skills can have students to make concept maps, flashcards, having them to do interactive games using vocabulary. And then I love this one. I used to do this as a teacher, having students to create their own dictionary and thesauruses that they're using throughout the academic year with pictures for our early learners. Okay, and this becomes kind of their toolbox that they have as they're exposed to new vocabulary. And I'm looking, we're getting a little close to time, and I'm almost finished. So for those of you that can stay on, I just want to get through this last few. But let's talk about phonics, because phonics is so important. So we have phonics and we have phonemic awareness, and there are two different strategies that you look at, because phonics looks at making learners make those connections between written language and spoken sounds. So it's a method of teaching, students to read by correlating those sounds and those letters, okay, together. Whereas phonemic awareness is the ability to hear, to notice, to manipulate words, predict students' reading success or difficulty. So by looking at the phonemic awareness, you'll know how successful they are and then what strategies you need to put in place for them for areas of difficulty. And it allows students to make connections of sounds in those corresponding letters or written documents. And so we should embed phonics, and some people ask me, how long? Should you just do it into first or to second? And my answer is, this is a strategy as long as students need it. You may need to continue to give them decodable text or to have them to work on phonics activities within your balanced literacy classroom until they have that sound foundation of phonics and or phonemic awareness. And then the last piece is looking at our speaking and listening, okay? So in a balanced literacy classroom, we have to have opportunities that students are building their listening skills and students are building their speaking skills, okay? So that explicit instruction, which builds learning skills to prepare students to express themselves clearly, creatively, and for a variety of purposes. To allowing opportunities for students to dialogue, to question, to video themselves, to hear themselves speak as they're acquiring English language. And then those listening skills in two, so that students listen, they are able to question, and they're able to learn from others through developing their listening skills. And if you look at the Common Core standards, we have standards that focus on this. So when we talk about, when I ask, think about your classroom at the beginning of the session, where do you focus your time? Making sure that you're hitting all of these literacy standards that we're not just focusing on reading and writing, but you're embedding vocabulary, spelling, phonemic awareness, speaking and listening into your lessons as well, to make sure that students can acquire English and be well-rounded readers and speakers as well. And here's just some of these strategies. I'm gonna just go over just a couple of these. The 5 core skills I love, and this helps students to elaborate and clarify, support their ideas with examples. I call them the 5 core skills because you can do this in a group, and you have students to elaborate. You may post an idea within one setting, and students elaborate through question and dialogue. So it's that 5 core. You set up, challenge, paraphrase, synthesize, and then students report back and answering the question and dialogue. Having accountable talk, so where students stay on topic, they use information that is appropriate. You teach them how to do this, how to think deeply and partner, and we call this that accountable talk, where students have authentic conversations with each other. And during an online setting, I would do this by having students to record themselves, grouping students in pairs, having them to record themselves and to hear themselves have accountable talk or have some of that authentic dialogue. Fishbowl discussions are great to use. This is where students pick topics from a fishbowl. It could be a topic that is about the unit of study. So if you're in a science class, you may have different words or different ideas within the fishbowl. If you're online, you may have them choose a card, and then you have some authentic conversations and students can speak, and they can also listen to their peers as well. And then we wrap this up, I've kind of shown you those digital literacy tools that are all embedded in this. So when we think about balanced literacy and putting those digital tools together, making sure that students are being creative. This goes back to the 4 C's, the critical thinking. So all of those skills that we've discussed today help them to be collaborative in the classroom. So we talked about well-being for English language learners, having them to have a safe environment where they can be collaborative, where they can be creative, those choice boards, different activities within the setting, and then building those functional and the creativity and thinking skills as well. So let's just kind of review the session. We've talked about balanced literacy as a holistic, comprehensive approach to teaching reading, writing, vocabulary, phonics, and grammar. So holistically, and how you can do this within a classroom or within a lesson. We've also looked at just some core strategies that you can use in your classroom for a whole group, those modeled lessons or those shared lessons, and then the smaller groups, those guided lessons, and then all of those to build independence so that students can write and read independently. And then we've also talked about some practical application for online learning, and I love that many of you shared within the groups and strategies that you've used. What we're going to do, if you're able to join us next week, we're going to take everything we've done in the last 3 weeks, and next week will be all strategy based. So we'll be showing balanced literacy in practice in a classroom. It will be showing the gradual release in practice and application, as well as the 4 C's. So it's going to look at inclusive practices, how you bridge differentiation, scaffolding within a classroom, working with diverse learners, and bringing all of the research that I've shared over the 3 weeks into practical application. And you'll be joined by some of your peers, and they'll be showing what's working well for them in the online setting. And I tell you, time really has gotten away from me. I know we joined a little bit late with my technology issues, but as you're thinking, just think about 3 things. I love 3, 2, 1s. I used to do this as a teacher myself. 3 things that you just learn about balanced literacy and the impact of student learning. And today I kind of broad stroked over guided reading. And then the month of May, I'm really going to dig deep into guided reading and shared reading. And I'm going to talk about lexile levels and running records and how to run this in a classroom. And that's going to be our 2nd series where we'll focus on guided reading, because I truly believe as we're working with students that are English as second language learners, we really need to look at core reading practices that we can use in our classroom. And then think about 2 questions you still have just to kind of guide us, and then 1 strategy that you will try to implement in your classroom. So put those things in the chat. And then as we're doing this, remember our theme was we were setting sail in balanced literacy. So I love this ending quote. I love quotes. It is not the ship so much as the skillful sailing that assures the prosperous voyage. So again, it's that skillful sailing, teaching students skills, those reading strategies, writing strategies, vocabulary strategies, so that they will be able to acquire English. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to take some time and answer some of your questions in the chat, in the Q&A, so I will be here as long as you need me. Those of you who joined me last week, some of us stayed on for about 20 minutes after the session, and that's great. We will definitely do that. We do have my next session. It will be the last. I'm so sad, but it will be the last of the Embracing Change. And again, it will be on inclusive practices for blended learning classrooms. So please register, and you can just find out more information about, the resources that we have for K12 through National Geographic Learning. You can find the webinar for next week, some exciting events that we have coming up for elementary teachers next week, as well as some teaching tips. Every Sunday, we will continue to add on our website teaching tips for K12, for our K12 teachers. So again, thank you for joining, and I'm going to spend some time looking at the chat and just answering some of your questions in the Q&A session. And someone just asked, can we get the presentation? You certainly can. It will be posted on our website. So right here, ngl-emea.com K12. So we will have the recording for this session on our website by tomorrow. Okay. Let me see some of the other questions here. And then, yes, you will have your certificate in the follow-up email that will come out within 2 days. And someone's asking for some more practical application for online learning. So thank you. I'm going to put that down as we're looking at our teacher tips and some of those resources. So thank you for that. Loving the strategies we discussed, and they want a few more for online learning.